The day Olive Crawford decided to knock on Albert Morgan's door, every soul in Dusthaven, New Mexico territory, told her she had lost her mind. It was the autumn of 1882, and the territory was a place where a widow with 2 young children and a failing homestead had exactly 3 options: remarry quickly to the first man who would have her, pack up and go east to beg relatives for shelter, or fight so hard against the land and the loneliness that she eventually broke. Olive Crawford had watched her husband Thomas go into the ground 6 months prior, taken by a fever that swept through their valley like a cruel whisper, and she had already refused the first 2 options so firmly that the town gossips had given up trying to suggest them, which left only the 3rd option, and the 3rd option had brought her, on a cold Tuesday morning in October, to stand at the base of Albert Morgan's porch steps with her boots caked in red New Mexico mud, and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth. Albert Morgan owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. He had purchased the land fair and square from men who were happy to sell, expanded it through drought and Indian summer, and the crash of beef prices in 1880 with a kind of quiet, relentless competence that made other ranchers simultaneously envious and bewildered. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that had started going gray at the temples, and eyes the particular color of storm clouds over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. He was also, by unanimous agreement of everyone who had ever attempted to do business with him, the most difficult, unyielding, stubborn man in the territory. He did not take on partners. He did not extend credit. He did not lend equipment, lease water rights, or make exceptions. When the Harmon brothers had approached him 2 years back about running their herd through his grazing land during a drought, he had turned them away without a second thought. When the town of Dusthaven had asked him to contribute to the construction of the new schoolhouse, he had sent exactly the amount required by the county ordinance and not a penny more. He had a reputation not for cruelty exactly, but for a kind of ironclad self-containment that made people feel, when they dealt with him, as though they were negotiating with a mountain. And yet here was Olive Crawford, 31 years old, wearing her best gray dress that was not quite good enough for anything, with her dark auburn hair pinned back under a bonnet she had mended twice, marching up those porch steps like she had every right in the world to be there. She raised her hand to knock. The door swung open before her knuckles connected with the wood. Albert Morgan stood in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He had obviously been on his way out, because he had his hat in one hand and a pair of leather gloves in the other, and his coat was already buttoned against the morning chill. He was taller than she remembered from seeing him at the Mercantile and at Sunday services, where he occupied the back pew with the focused disengagement of a man who had agreed to be present but reserved the right to remain elsewhere in spirit. He looked at her. She looked at him. The wind moved through the cottonwood trees at the edge of his yard and scattered a handful of yellow leaves across the porch boards between them. "Mrs. Crawford," he said. "Mr. Morgan," she said. "I was going to knock." "I know," he said. "I saw you coming up the road about 10 minutes ago. I had time to wonder what you wanted and time to decide I wasn't going to help, and then you climbed those steps with that look on your face, and I changed my mind before I even opened the door." Olive blinked. In all the speeches she had prepared in her head during the 2-mile walk from her homestead to his ranch house, she had not prepared for the door to open before she knocked, and she had certainly not prepared for him to say something like that. "You changed your mind," she said. "About what?" "You don't even know what I'm asking." "No," he said, "but whatever it is, the answer is yes. Come inside before that wind picks up. I'll put coffee on." She stood there for a moment longer, not quite sure what to do with a man who had dismantled her carefully constructed argument before she had spoken a single word of it. Then she went inside. His house was not what she had expected. She had imagined the home of a man like Albert Morgan to be functional and cold, a place arranged for efficiency rather than comfort. Instead, the front room was warm and full of books. Not just a few books arranged on a shelf for show, but real books, stacked on shelves that ran floor to ceiling on two walls, overflowing onto a side table near the window, two more lying open on the desk in the corner. The fireplace was lit, and there was a braided rug in front of it in shades of burgundy and gold, worn soft with use. A carved wooden chess set occupied a small table near the window, pieces mid-game, as though whoever had been playing had simply stepped away for a moment. She sat in the chair he gestured toward and took her bonnet off and held it in her lap while he disappeared through a doorway toward what she assumed was the kitchen. She could hear him moving around, the clink of a coffee pot, the creak of a stove grate. She looked at the chess game on the table. She looked at the books. She looked at the framed map of New Mexico territory on the wall above the fireplace, with penciled notations in the margins she was too far away to read. He came back with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without asking how she took it, which she realized was because there was nothing to put in it, no cream, no sugar, just coffee, strong and black and hot. She held the cup in both hands and let it warm her fingers. He sat down across from her and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and waited. "My husband left debts," she said. She had decided on the long walk over that she was not going to preface anything with apologies or softening language. She was going to state the facts. "Not enormous debts, but enough that the bank is making noise about the property. I have 2 children. My son Eli is 9 and my daughter Clara is 6. I have 120 acres, a house in reasonable repair, a barn that needs work on the eastern wall, a small apple orchard that hasn't been properly tended in 2 years, and a kitchen garden. I have 11 head of cattle, which is not enough to run a profitable operation, but is enough to indicate that the land can support cattle. I have no hired hands because I cannot afford them. I have no family within 500 miles. I have $7.40 in the bank, and I have until the 1st of December to pay 3 months of back interest on the note the bank holds on my property, which comes to $42. She stopped. She took a sip of the coffee. It was very good coffee, she noticed despite herself. Albert Morgan had not moved or changed expression during any of this. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his coffee cup in both hands, and he watched her with an attention so complete that it was almost uncomfortable. $42, he said. Yes, and you came to me. I came to you because I've tried everything else, she said, and there was no self-pity in it, just the flat statement of a woman who had done the arithmetic. I asked the bank for an extension and they said no. I asked the Reverend Calloway about the church benevolence fund and was told it was reserved for widows whose husbands had died in a state of proper church-going. And Thomas, God rest him, had not set foot in a church in the 3 years before he died. I asked Mrs. Patterson at the dry goods if she would buy some of my orchard preserves on account against future credit, and she was willing, but it would only get me $12, which is not enough. I have looked at this problem from every angle available to me, and the only thing I have not done is come to you. Because everyone told you I would say no. Because everyone told me you would say no, she agreed. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind was picking up the way he had predicted, rattling the window glass in its frame. Somewhere on the property, a horse made a low, restless sound. I will pay the bank note, he said. She opened her mouth. And before you say anything, he continued, I am not doing it as charity, and I am not doing it as a loan, because loans between neighbors in situations like yours tend to breed resentment, and I have enough enemies in this county without adding you to the list. I will pay it as advance payment for a business arrangement. What kind of business arrangement? Your land sits on the northern edge of the valley, he said, and the creek that runs through it is the same creek that feeds the southern pasture of my operation before it bends west. For 2 years I have been watching that creek get lower every summer because the beaver dams upstream on your property have been silting up and no one is managing them. If those dams fail, I lose water access to about 300 acres of grazing land during dry season. That is worth considerably more than $42 to me, which means the arrangement would be fair and in my interest as well as yours." She stared at him. "You want to manage my beaver dams?" "I want to send 2 of my men up to manage the beaver dams. In exchange, I will pay your bank note." "I will also," he said, and here something shifted very slightly in his expression, something that was not quite softness but was the absence of the wall that had been there before. "Send those same 2 men to fix the eastern wall of your barn, because a barn with a failing wall is a danger to your livestock and your children both, and I will not have that on my conscience when I could do something about it." Olive sat very still with her coffee cup and considered him. "Mr. Morgan," she said slowly, "the beaver dam work and the bank note I could accept as a business arrangement. I can see the logic of it and it is fair, but the barn wall is not part of that calculation." "No," he agreed. "It is not. Then why?" He looked at her for a long moment. The fire popped behind him. The wind shook the window. "Because you walked 2 miles in the cold to knock on the door that nobody knocks on," he said. "And I watched you come up that road and I watched the way you walked. And it was the walk of someone who had already been told no every other place they tried and was going to ask anyway. And I have not had very much respect for very many people in my life, Mrs. Crawford. But I had a considerable amount of it for you before you even reached the porch steps." Olive Crawford, who had held herself together through 6 months of grief and debt and loneliness, and the relentless daily grind of trying to keep a farm running without the person she had run it with, felt something loosen dangerously in her chest. She pressed her lips together and looked at the braided rug and breathed very carefully until the moment passed. "The barn wall," she said. "The barn wall," he said. "And we will call it a gesture of neighborly goodwill, and neither of us will make more of it than that." She looked up and found him watching her with that same grave attention, and she nodded once firmly, the way she had been nodding at things for 6 months because nodding was how she got through them. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan." "Albert," he said. "If we are going to be doing business, you might as well call me Albert." She put her bonnet back on. "Olive," she said. He walked her to the door and watched her down the porch steps, and she felt his eyes on her back all the way to the gate at the end of his yard, and she did not turn around, though she was not entirely sure why. His men came the next morning. 2 of them, a quiet, capable pair named Ruiz and Dawes, who arrived at first light with a wagon full of lumber and tools, and went straight to work on the barn wall without requiring any direction from her. Eli stood on the fence and watched them with the focused attention of a 9-year-old who was trying to memorize everything, and Clara trailed after Olive all morning asking questions about the men and the lumber and whether they were going to stay for supper. Olive made them stay for supper because it was the right thing to do, and because her mother had raised her to understand that hospitality was not something you suspended when you were struggling. She made cornbread and fried the last of the salt pork, and put up a pot of beans that had been soaking since the night before, and Ruiz and Dawes ate with the serious appreciation of men who were accustomed to camp cooking, and Eli told them everything he knew about barn construction, which was not very much but was delivered with great confidence. Ruiz mentioned, in passing, that Mr. Morgan had said to tell her the bank draft would be delivered directly to the First Territorial Bank of Dusthaven that same afternoon. She thanked him and meant it, and that night after the children were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low and thought about storm-gray eyes and a door that had opened before she finished raising her hand. She did not allow herself to think about it for long. She was a practical woman and she had practical things to attend to. But she thought about it. 3 days later, Albert Morgan appeared at her fence line on horseback, alone, without the customary 2-day advance notice that business dealings in the territory generally required. She was in the apple orchard when she heard the hoofbeats, pruning shears in hand, working through the neglected trees with the systematic attention they needed, and she looked up and saw him sitting his horse at the gate with an expression she could not quite read. She walked over to him, and he tipped his hat and she said, "You could have sent word." "I was passing this way anyway," he said, which she was fairly certain was not entirely true, given that his ranch was 2 miles in the opposite direction from town, and there was no particular reason for him to pass this way unless he meant to. "I wanted to see how Ruiz and Dawes got on with the barn." She led him around to the barn, and he looked at the new wall with the critical eye of a man who knew construction work, and then said it was good work, which she had already known. Then he looked at the apple orchard where she had been working, and something shifted in his expression. "You know what you're doing in there," he said. "My father had an orchard in Missouri," she said. "I grew up in one. Those trees haven't been pruned in 2 seasons. I know. Thomas didn't grow up on an orchard." She looked at the trees, which were leggy and crossing and in desperate need of another week of work. "I'm getting to them. I have a man who knows fruit trees," Albert said. "He worked an orchard operation in California before he came out here." She turned to look at him. "Albert." "Neighborly goodwill," he said simply, and his expression was perfectly serious, which somehow made it worse because she could not tell if he was teasing her or if he genuinely did not understand the asymmetry of what he kept offering. "At some point," she said, "the goodwill tips into something else." "What does it tip into?" She looked at him for a moment. He was sitting his horse with the easy comfort of a man who had been on horseback most of his life, and the morning light was doing something particularly unreasonable to the gray at his temples, and she was suddenly very aware that she was standing in a muddy apple orchard with pruning shears in her hand, and there were probably leaves in her hair. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'll tell you when I figure it out." He smiled then, and it changed his face completely. It was a slow smile, like sun coming over a ridge, something that took its time and therefore meant more when it arrived. She had never seen him smile before, she realized. In the years they had been neighbors and occasional fellow churchgoers, she had never once seen Albert Morgan smile. She found herself smiling back before she could stop herself. He came back the following week, and the week after that, and each time he had a reason that was technically legitimate. Once to check on the creek management progress. Once because he had found a section of fencing on the property line that was down and brought materials to fix it. Once because he was passing this way anyway, which was becoming their private joke for any visit that did not require further explanation. He always stayed exactly as long as was appropriate and left before it could be otherwise. And he always spoke to Eli with the particular focused seriousness that boys of 9 require from men they have decided to admire. And he always made a point of addressing Clara directly and not above her head, which Clara had decided made him wonderful. "Mr. Morgan brought peppermint drops," Clara informed Olive one evening, producing them from her pocket with the satisfaction of someone who had been saving this announcement. "Did he? He said he had them in his coat pocket from a long time ago and he didn't want them anymore." Clara popped one in her mouth. "I think he bought them special." "Clara." "He looked at me like he bought them special," Clara said serenely. Olive looked at her 6-year-old daughter with the unsettling feeling that children understood things that adults worked very hard not to understand, and said nothing. In November, the first real snow of the season came down out of the mountains on a Thursday night, and by Friday morning Olive's world was white and silent, and the temperature had dropped hard enough to make the water in the pitcher on her nightstand freeze around the edges. She got the fire going and got the children fed and wrapped herself in Thomas's old coat and went out to break the ice on the water trough and check on the cattle, and found that the eastern pasture gate had blown open in the night and 3 of her 11 cattle were gone. She stood in the snow and looked at the open gate and thought, with the very particular calm of someone who has exceeded their capacity for disaster, that this was going to be a problem. She could track them herself. She had done it before. But the snow was deep enough that it would be a full day's work, maybe 2, and she could not leave the children and she could not take them with her in this cold, and she did not have a hired hand and she could not afford one, and the cattle represented roughly 1/3 of her breeding stock, and losing them permanently was not something she could recover from this season. She went back inside and looked at the situation honestly, and then she rode to Albert Morgan's ranch. He was in the yard when she arrived. directing two of his men on something to do with a wagon wheel, and he looked up when she came through the gate and immediately walked toward her, because there was something in the way she was sitting the horse that communicated the nature of the visit without words. She told him about the cattle. She told him about the gate and the snow and the children and the tracking that needed to be done. She told him all of it in the flat, factual way she had told him about the bank note, without apology or embellishment. He turned to the two men with the wagon. "Leave that," he said. "Ruiz, take Dawes and Rodriguez and follow Mrs. Crawford back to her property. There are 3 head of cattle to track. Find them and get them back." He paused. "Take the heavy ropes. The snow is deep enough they might have gotten into the creek draw." Ruiz nodded and moved immediately, calling to the others, the kind of effortless response to authority that spoke of a well-run operation and men who trusted the man giving orders. Albert looked back at her. "Go home and stay warm," he said. "My men will handle it." "Come with them," she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out of her without permission, and she heard it hanging in the cold air between them and could not take it back. And Albert Morgan looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, surprised, just for a moment, genuinely surprised, as though he had not expected that word from her. "Please," she said. "I would feel better. The children are alone in the house and I don't want to leave them for long, and I would feel better if you were the one out there." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and went to get his horse. They found the cattle in the creek draw, exactly as Albert had predicted, 2 of them tangled in brush, and one standing in the shallow edge of the freezing water with the stoic bewilderment of an animal that has gotten into a situation it does not know how to exit. Ruiz and Dawes and Rodriguez worked the ropes while Albert and Olive stood on the bank, and Albert said, quietly, without looking at her, "You rode out here alone in this snow." "I have ridden in worse." "That is not what I said." She looked at him. His jaw was set and there was something in his voice she had not heard before, something that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it, the particular tone of someone who cares about a thing and is not entirely comfortable with how much they care about it. "Albert," she said, "you could have sent Eli to the McKinnon place. They're closer than I am and they would have helped." "The McKinnons are dealing with a sick baby," she said. "I didn't want to trouble them. So you trouble me instead." "Yes," she said simply, "because you told me to." He turned to look at her then, and she met his gaze without flinching, which she had learned was the only way to deal with Albert Morgan, because he was the kind of man who read hesitation as uncertainty and uncertainty as an invitation to fill the space with his own opinion. But he did not fill the space this time. He just looked at her in the thin winter light with snow on his shoulders, and that expression she could not quite name, and then he looked back at his men pulling the cattle out of the brush. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I did." They got the cattle back to her pasture, and Ruiz repaired the gate properly this time, reinforcing the hinge that had given way. And by the time they were done it was past noon, and the children had been inside alone for 3 hours. Olive went in and found Eli feeding the fire with the careful attention of someone who had been trusted and intended to honor it, and Clara sitting at the table with her rag doll, telling the doll everything that was happening outside in a grave and informative tone. Albert came to the door. He did not come in. He stood at the threshold with his hat in his hands and said, "Everything is set. The gate will hold through the winter." "Thank you," she said. "You come in, I can have lunch ready in." "No," he said, then more quietly, "Thank you, but no." She looked at him. He looked at her. Clara from the table said, "Mr. Morgan, Alois wants to know why you never come in." Olive pressed her lips together. Albert looked at Clara with perfect gravity. "Who is Alois?" "My doll." "Ah," he seemed to consider this seriously. "Tell Alois that I didn't want to impose on your mother's time." "She says that's not the real reason," Clara said. "Clara," Olive said. "She's very perceptive," Albert said, and there was that slow smile again, and Olive thought with some frustration that a man who smiled like that should not be allowed to do it casually, standing in other people's doorways in winter, and then tell Alois. He paused. Something shifted. He put his hat back on. "Tell Alois she's right," he said, "and that I will come in for supper sometime if your mother is willing." He was looking at Olive when he said it. "Friday," she said before she finished deciding to say it. "Come for supper Friday, 6 o'clock." He nodded once. "Friday," he said, and turned and walked back to where his horse was tied, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go. Clara put her doll down and looked at Olive with enormous eyes. "Eloise is very pleased," Clara said. "Eloise," Olive said, "should mind her own business." But she was smiling when she closed the door. She spent Thursday baking bread and a dried apple pie and trying not to think about the fact that she was baking bread and a dried apple pie. She told herself she was doing it because she would do it for any neighbor who came to supper, which was more or less true, and also not the entire truth. And she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge the gap between those two things even while she declined to examine it too closely. Eli, who had absorbed the news of Albert Morgan's coming to supper with the focused interest of a boy who had decided, somewhere in the past several weeks, that this particular man was worth paying attention to, asked if he could show Mr. Morgan his collection of arrowheads. "If he is interested," Olive said. "He will be," Eli said, with the certainty of 9 years old. Albert arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, which she would learn later was characteristic of him. Not early, which would be presumptuous, not late, which would be careless, but exactly on time because he took other people's time seriously. He came to the front door, which no one who visited the homestead ever used, and he had cleaned up, which she noticed without meaning to. His shirt was clean and his dark hair was combed back and he had shaved, and she was holding a dish towel and she thought, somewhat helplessly, that this was a dangerous development. She let him in and he looked at her house the way she had looked at his, taking inventory not out of nosiness, but out of the genuine curiosity of a person who was interested in understanding where someone lived. He looked at the rag rug by the door that she had made herself. He looked at the watercolor of a Missouri hillside that had been her mother's, and that she had carried all the way from Kansas when she and Thomas had come west. He looked at the shelf of school primers where Eli's lessons were kept and the lower shelf of picture books that were Clara's. "Sit down," she said. "Supper will be ready in 10 minutes." He sat at the table and Eli immediately materialized from somewhere and placed his arrowhead collection between them on the table and launched into an explanation. Albert leaned forward and examined each one with genuine attention, asking questions that demonstrated he actually knew something about the ancestral Puebloans who had left artifacts throughout this region, and Eli's face went through several shades of delighted disbelief at finding an adult who knew more than he did and was willing to discuss it. Clara sat across from Albert and watched him with the unblinking attention of a 6-year-old and said, at one point, "You are not as scary as people say." Albert glanced at Olive. Olive concentrated on the pot on the stove. "What do people say?" Albert asked. "That you are very mean and cold and you don't help anybody," Clara said. "But Mama said she stopped." "Clara," Olive said. "What did your mother say?" Albert said, and his voice was careful and Olive could feel him not looking at her. "She said that wasn't her experience," Clara said. "She said people don't always know." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment except for the sound of the stove. "Your mother," Albert said, "is unusually perceptive." Supper was good. The bread had turned out well and the beans were properly seasoned and the dried apple pie was, she knew objectively, some of her best work. Albert ate with the appreciation of a man who was accustomed to eating alone or with cowboys, which is to say he ate everything she put in front of him and said very little about it but said it with complete sincerity. Eli talked about school and the arrowheads and the cattle and a book he was reading about natural history. Clara talked about Eloise. After supper, Albert helped her clear the table, which she had not expected, and which Eli watched with fascinated attention. Then he sat by the fireplace while she put the children to bed, and when she came back he was reading the spine of one of the books on her small shelf by the window. "Audubon," he said. "My father's." He held it gently, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else's memory. "My mother had the same one." He set it back on the shelf. She sat down in the chair across from his, and the fire was warm, and outside the wind was doing its winter business against the windows, and she recognized this with some alarm, one of the most comfortable evenings she had spent in a very long time. "What was she like?" Olive said. "Your mother." He looked at her with a slight surprise, as though he had not expected the question. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Principled," he said finally. "Stubborn in the good way." She believed very strongly that a person's word was the sum of their character and that everything else was secondary. He paused. "She would have liked you." Olive felt the warmth of that in the center of her chest. "Why?" "Because you said exactly what you needed and asked for exactly what you came for and didn't dress it up or apologize for it," he said. She had no patience for people who couldn't say directly what they meant. "Your father," a small pause. "He was not well suited to this country," Albert said. "He was a good man, but he was not built for the West. He went back east when I was 12. My mother stayed. She raised you here alone. She raised me here. She hired a good foreman and she kept a small operation going, and she did not ask for anything from anyone that she wasn't prepared to return in equal measure." He looked at the fire. "She died 4 years ago. The ranch was hers. She left it to me." "I'm sorry," Olive said. "Don't be. It was a good life and she chose it deliberately, every step of it." He looked at her. "I think about that sometimes, the deliberateness of it." "I think about it too," she said. "I did not choose this particular version of my life, but I am choosing what to do with it now that I'm in it." Something moved across his face, slow and significant, like weather changing over mountains. "Yes," he said quietly. "You are." He left before 9 o'clock, which was proper, and he shook her hand at the door, which was also proper, and she noted that his hand was warm and his grip was firm, and he held her hand a beat longer than a handshake strictly required before he released it. She stood in the doorway and watched his horse disappear into the dark, and then stood there a moment longer in the cold, looking at the dark where he had been. She went inside and banked the fire and went to bed, and lay for a long time looking at the ceiling, and decided that she was, against all practical wisdom, in considerable danger. Through November and into December, Dusthaven watched with the particular attention that small frontier towns bring to bear on situations of interest. The fact that Albert Morgan had been seen at Olive Crawford's homestead 3 times in a month was known. The fact that he had come to supper on a Friday was known. The fact that his 2 men had repaired her barn wall and tracked her cattle was known. In a town of 400 people spread across 20 miles of high desert valley, very little escaped notice, and the prevailing interpretation of the available evidence was divided between those who thought Albert Morgan was finally doing something human, and those who thought Olive Crawford was being impractical about a man whose help had strings attached that she had not yet seen. Miriam Calloway, the Reverend's wife, took it upon herself to visit Olive on a Tuesday with a basket of dried apricots and a long look. "People are talking," Miriam said, sitting at Olive's kitchen table with her hands folded. "People talk," Olive said, pouring coffee. "He is not an easy man, Olive." "I am not a particularly easy woman." Miriam looked at her with the expression of a woman who wants to say something she knows she has no right to say. "Thomas has been gone 6 months. 6.5, Olive said. "And I am not replacing Thomas. I am not capable of replacing Thomas, and Albert Morgan is not Thomas, and I have no intention of pretending that any of this is what it isn't." She set the coffee down. "What I have is a neighbor who helped me when I needed it and has become a friend. Beyond that, I have not declared anything, and neither has he." Miriam was quiet. "But you love him," Miriam said. Olive looked at her coffee cup for a long time. "I don't know yet what I feel," she said carefully. "I know that when he comes through the gate, I breathe differently. I know that he talks to my children like they matter. I know that I have not felt as though I was getting through each day instead of living it since before Thomas got sick, and some of that has to do with Albert Morgan." She paused. And I know that I am 31 years old and a widow with debts and 2 children, and whatever I feel needs to be examined very carefully before I allow it to become anything." Miriam looked at her with something shifting in her expression. "That is very practical," she said. "I am a very practical woman." "Yes," Miriam said, "you are." "But Olive," she stopped. "He watches you in church. He has been sitting 2 pews closer to the front than he used to." Olive looked up from her coffee. "2 pews," she said. "Two," Miriam confirmed. Olive was quiet. The fire popped. Outside, a horse whickered from the direction of the pasture. "He watches you the way a man watches something he is afraid of losing before he's had the chance to hold it," Miriam said. She reached out and put her hand over Olive's briefly. "I'm not telling you to rush anything. I'm telling you that I think the danger is mutual." After Miriam left, Olive stood at the kitchen window for a long time and looked out at the winter-pale pasture and the mountains beyond, and thought about the fact that Albert Morgan had moved 2 pews closer. He came by the following Saturday on the pretense of checking whether the creek management work had been properly winterized, which was a reasonable thing to check and also, she suspected, only partially the reason. She was splitting kindling in the side yard when he arrived, and she was not going to stop splitting kindling on his account, and she didn't. He leaned against the fence and watched her for a moment and then went to the woodpile and began splitting kindling alongside her, picking up the second hatchet that was hanging on the fence post without asking. They worked in silence for a while, which was one of the things she had noticed about him, that he was completely comfortable with silence, that he did not feel the need to fill it, that quiet between them was not uncomfortable but companionable. "I want to ask you something," she said. He split a piece of kindling cleanly in two. "Ask. Why do you live alone?" He looked at her from across the woodpile. "I have men on the property. You know what I mean." He was quiet for a moment, setting up another piece of wood. "I was engaged once," he said. 10 years ago, she decided she did not want to live in the territory. She went back east. He split the wood. I thought at the time that the land mattered more than the person, and I stayed. I have spent some time since then reconsidering whether I made the right calculation." Olive stopped and looked at him. "Did you love her?" "I thought so," he said. "Now I think I was in love with the idea of being the kind of man who could provide what she needed. That is a different thing." She thought about this. She thought about Thomas, who she had loved truly and well, who had been her partner and her friend, and who had died too young and too fast and left a hole in her life the shape of a person. She thought about what it meant to start caring for someone new after that, not as a replacement but as a different thing entirely, something that had its own weight and its own shape. "Thomas was a good man," she said. "I want you to know that. He was not perfect and he was not always practical and he left me with debt, but he was a good man and I loved him." "I know," Albert said. "I could tell, from the way you talked about him that morning in my house." "You did not make him smaller or larger than he was." She looked at him. "I am not looking for someone to fill a space," she said. "I want you to know that too." He set the hatchet down. He turned to face her fully, and the winter light was flat and clear, and it lit up the fine lines around his eyes and the gray at his temples, and he looked at her with that complete, unwavering attention. "What are you looking for?" he said. It was perhaps the most direct question anyone had asked her in years. She thought about giving a careful, measured answer. She thought about deflecting. She thought about all the very good practical reasons to take this slowly and say very little and see what developed without committing to a name for it. "Something real," she said instead. "Something that doesn't require me to be less than I am or need less than I need. Something where the person sees me clearly and chooses me anyway." The wind moved through the yard and lifted a strand of her hair that had come loose from its pin, and Albert Morgan looked at her with the expression of a man who has been given an answer he was not sure he deserved to receive. "That," he said, quietly and with great precision, "is exactly what I am capable of offering." She believed him. She believed him the way you believe a thing that your bones already knew before your mind caught up, the way the land believes spring is coming even before the first thaw. She went back to splitting kindling. He picked up the hatchet and did the same. But there was something different in the air between them now, something that had been unnamed and was still unnamed, but felt less dangerous for having been approached from either side. He came to supper again that week, and the week after, and by January it had become a Friday thing, a known and expected and privately savored thing. Eli had started calling him Albert, which had happened gradually and which Albert had not discouraged. Clara had given Alois a secondary name, which was Alois Morgan, and had not yet been persuaded to explain why, and Olive had chosen to wait that particular situation out. One Friday in January, after supper, when the children were in bed and the fire was burning down and they were sitting across from each other in the quiet of the kitchen, Albert said, "I would like to court you properly, Olive." She looked at him. "I am saying it plainly," he said, "because you have the right to consider it plainly and say no if that is your answer, and I would rather hear no plainly than have you feel as though you cannot say it." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp was turned low and the fire gave most of the light, and it did something warm and particular to the angles of his face. "It is not my answer," she said. He let out a breath, small, controlled, barely visible, but she saw it, and she understood that he had been holding it for some time. "Then I will court you," he said, "as properly as this territory allows." "Which is not very properly," she said. "No," he agreed and smiled that slow, ridge-lined smile. "But I will do my best." He did his best. In Dusthaven in 1883, proper courtship meant being seen together at Sunday services and at the general store, and at the occasional community gathering, which Albert had previously avoided with the dedication of a man who had better things to do and now attended with the dedicated presence of a man who had better reasons. It meant bringing gifts that were practical, a bag of coffee beans, a bolt of good wool fabric, a set of primers for Eli's lessons that were more advanced than what the school provided. It meant conversation and presence and the slow, careful process of learning a person. What it also meant, on the day in February when a late blizzard came down out of the mountains and trapped him at her homestead because the roads were impassable, was sitting beside her at the kitchen table, while the children slept and talking until the small hours of the morning about things neither of them had talked about to anyone in a very long time. He told her about growing up on the ranch with his mother, about learning cattle from the ground up, about the man his mother had hired as foreman, a former Buffalo soldier named Clement who had come west after the war, and who had taught Albert more about reading land and weather and livestock than any school could have. She told him about Missouri and the apple orchard and her father, who had been a school teacher and who had believed that education was the closest thing to actual freedom that existed in the world, and how that belief had shaped her completely. He told her about the decade of building the ranch into what it was, the years of driving cattle north to the railroad, the negotiations and the legal battles over water rights and grazing leases, the constant management of men and land and weather and price fluctuations that ranching required, and how most people saw only the result and not the exhausting, unending work that produced it. She told him about the early years of her marriage, the move west with Thomas, the building of the homestead from a tent and a wagon to a house and a barn, the first winter that was almost the end of them, the way they had survived it by being two people who refused to consider the alternative. "You are not afraid of much," he said. "I am afraid of quite a lot," she said. "I am just more afraid of stopping than I am of continuing." He looked at her across the lamplight. "That is the bravest thing I have ever heard stated simply." She felt the heat rise in her face and looked down at her coffee cup and then looked back up because she was done with looking away from things. "Albert," she said. "Yes, stop being so." She stopped, trying to find the word. "What? Exactly what you are," she finished. "Because I am running out of reasons to be careful." He was very still for a moment. The storm outside was a low, constant roar against the walls of the house. The lamp flame bent slightly despite the closed windows. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. just that, his hand over hers, warm and certain and without any ambiguity whatsoever. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a long time, talking and not talking, and the storm did what storms do. And by morning, when it was over, the world was white and new and blinding with sunlight on fresh snow, and Albert dug his horse out of the shelter of her barn and saddled up to go home, and she stood on the porch and watched him, and before he turned his horse toward the road he looked back at her. "Olive," he said, "yes, I believe I am in love with you." She stood in the cold white morning with her arms around herself against the chill, and her heart doing something entirely unreasonable. "I believe," she said carefully, "that I am in love with you too." He turned his horse and rode home, and she stood on the porch until he was gone, and then she went inside and pressed both hands flat against the kitchen table and breathed very carefully, and then she started making breakfast because the children would be up soon and the world, as always, required attending to. But she was smiling. She was smiling the way she had not smiled in so long that the muscles of it felt new, like using something you had almost forgotten you had. The spring came, and with it a complication. His name was Franklin Geary, and he was a land speculator out of Santa Fe who had been buying up homestead properties throughout the valley for the past 2 years, acquiring them from widows and failing farmers at prices well below their value, and then either reselling them at profit or, in several cases, leasing the water rights to railroad interests who were beginning to look at this part of the territory with considerable appetite. He had approached Olive once before in the fall, and she had turned him down. In March he came back. She was in the orchard, which had responded beautifully to Albert's man's attention and her own, the trees pruned and limbed out and beginning to show the first signs of the spring growth that would build toward a proper harvest, when Geary rode up the lane in a buggy that was too fine for the roads and wore a coat that was too clean for the territory. He was pleasant in the way of men who want something and know that pleasantness is the cheaper approach before pressure. He offered her $800 for the property. The property was worth, conservatively, twice that, and she told him so. He smiled and said values in the area were uncertain, and he was offering a guaranteed sum. She said her situation had improved considerably since they last spoke. He asked if she was sure about that, and there was something in the way he asked it that made the back of her neck prickle. After he left, she told Albert. Albert's expression did not change very much, but his eyes went still in a particular way that she was learning to read, the way they went still when he was containing something that wanted to move. "Geary has acquired 4 properties in the past 18 months, he said. Every one of them belonged to someone with a bank note. He approaches the bank first and buys the notes, and then he has leverage." She stared at him. "Does he have my note?" "I paid your note in October," Albert said. "He cannot touch it." She let out a breath. "Who are the bank officers working with him?" "There are 2, Albert said. "I have been aware of what Geary is doing for some time. I have been gathering documentation." He paused. "I was going to deal with it before it reached you again. I should have moved faster. You are not responsible for every problem in this valley." "No," he said, "but I am responsible for this one. Because I know about it, and I have the resources to address it, and I have been moving carefully when I should have been moving decisively." He went to Santa Fe the following week, and she did not know exactly what he did there. But he came back with a territorial attorney, and a folder of documentation that the attorney took to the county clerk's office and filed in ways that resulted, within 3 weeks, in Franklin Geary being informed by the territorial court that his land acquisition practices were under review for fraud against the bank's depositors. Geary left the county and did not come back, and the 2 bank officers resigned, and the new bank president came personally to offer Olive a formal apology and confirmation that her account was in good standing. Albert did not make a production of any of this. He told her what had been done and what the outcome was, and she thanked him, and he said it needed doing regardless of anything else. "You have been gathering that documentation since before I came to your door," she said. "Since before," he confirmed. "You were going to deal with it eventually." "Yes, without telling anyone. Telling people creates panic, and panic makes things harder to address cleanly. She looked at him. Albert. Yes, you are a remarkably complicated man. I know, he said, without particular pleasure or displeasure, just the flat acknowledgement of someone who has lived with himself long enough to have arrived at an accurate assessment. But I am honest about it. You are, she said. That is the most important part. Spring turned into summer, and summer on the New Mexico high desert was a different world from winter, dry and burning and brilliant, the sky a blue that looked painted, the land going gold and dusty rose with heat. The orchard began to show the promise of what it could become, the trees carrying more bloom than she had seen in 2 years, and Eli discovered that he wanted to learn to ride properly, and that Albert was willing to teach him. And on Saturday mornings through June and July, Olive would sit on the fence and watch her son on the back of one of Albert's gentler horses, following Albert's quiet instructions with the focused concentration of a child who desperately wanted to get it right. She watched the way Albert taught him, patient but not indulgent, willing to repeat a thing as many times as needed without any diminishment of attention, calling out corrections that were specific and clear. And then, when Eli got it right, looking at him with a direct, sincere satisfaction that was somehow more affirming than enthusiasm. She watched Eli responding to it, sitting straighter, trying harder, not because he was afraid of disappointing Albert, but because Albert's approval felt worth earning. Something ached in her chest, watching them. It ached with something that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it, the recognition that Thomas was not here to see this, to see his son becoming this particular version of himself. And alongside that recognition, quiet and careful and real, the understanding that Albert Morgan was not filling the space Thomas had left but was making a new space entirely, his own shape, irreplaceable in its own right. On a Sunday afternoon in late July, they were sitting on the porch of her house while the children played in the yard, and the heat was settling into something bearable as the sun began to drop toward the western mountains, and Albert said, "I would like to ask you to marry me." She had been expecting it and also somehow had not been expecting it at all. She looked at the yard, where Eli was showing Clara some game involving a stick and a series of complicated rules that Clara was not entirely following. She looked at the mountains. She looked at Albert. "I want to be clear about what that would mean," he said. In the careful way he said all the things that mattered. "It would mean combining the properties, which makes business sense, and which I am not using as a reason but which is honestly a benefit. It would mean that Eli and Clara would be my children in every practical and legal sense I could make them, and I would take that seriously. It would mean," he stopped, started again. "It would mean that I would like to spend the rest of my life on the same land as you, looking at the same mountains, in the same house." He looked at her. "I am not a simple man or an easy man, and I know that. But I have been more alive in the past 9 months than I have been in the previous decade, and all of that is because of you." Olive looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the door that had opened before she finished raising her hand. She thought about the first time he smiled, on the road by her orchard, sun coming over a ridge. She thought about the blizzard night and his hand over hers on the kitchen table. She thought about Eli on horseback and Clara with her renamed doll. "Yes," she said. He looked at her like she had given him something he had stopped quite believing he would receive. "Yes," he said. "Albert," she said patiently, "I just said yes." He reached over and took her hand the same way he had taken it in the lamplight of the blizzard night and held it with that certain, unambiguous warmth, and she held his back. "Mama," Clara called from the yard, "why is Mr. Morgan holding your hand?" "Because I am going to marry your mother," Albert called back, which was a more direct answer than Olive had been preparing. Clara stared at him. Then she looked at Eli. Then she looked back at Albert with the enormous gravity of 6 years old. "Does that mean you'll live here?" she demanded. "It means you'll all come to live at the ranch," Albert said, "if that is acceptable to you." "My room," Clara said, clearly beginning to negotiate. "You may have any room you choose," Albert said. "And Alois." "Alois is obviously included." Clara put her hands on her hips and looked at him for a long moment, conducting some internal assessment. "Alois says yes," she announced. "I am glad," Albert said seriously. "Her approval was important to me." They were married in September of 1883, in the small white church where Albert had been moving 2 pews closer for the better part of a year, in front of the whole town of Dusthaven, which turned out in numbers that suggested they had all been waiting for this event considerably longer than either of the principals had. The Reverend Calloway performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, and Miriam Calloway, sitting in the front pew, spent most of it trying not to cry and failing. Olive wore the blue dress she had made that summer from the wool fabric Albert had brought in February, and she had done her auburn hair in a way she had not done it in years. And when Albert saw her come through the church door, something moved across his face that she would think about for the rest of her life, something unguarded and total and completely, entirely honest. Eli walked her down the aisle, which had been his idea, delivered with quiet dignity, and Clara walked behind them, scattering dried flowers in a fashion that was more enthusiastic than precise, and Ruiz and Dawes and Rodriguez and most of the ranch hands sat in the back rows like a delegation from a small country that had decided to observe proceedings closely. The vows were the traditional ones. They said them looking directly at each other, and Olive thought, as she said them, that she meant each one with a precision she had not expected, not because the words were new, but because this person was new, because what she felt was new, because it sat alongside everything else she had ever felt and did not crowd or diminish it, but lived in its own place, full and real. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend Calloway said, and Albert Morgan kissed her in front of the whole assembled population of Dusthaven, New Mexico Territory, which for a man who had spent the better part of a decade in careful, self-contained solitude was its own kind of remarkable statement. The town celebrated with them on the church lawn in the September afternoon, tables of food and a fiddle player and a guitar player, and the general festive noise of people who are happy for other people, and also glad of a reason to be out in the good weather. Old Hector Vasquez, who was 80 years old and had been in this valley since before there was a Dusthaven, came to shake Albert's hand and told him in Spanish that it was past time, which Albert received with a slight smile and agreed with completely. They moved Olive and the children to the ranch house the following week. The children took rooms at the end of the hall, Eli's dominated almost immediately by his Arrowhead collection, and the new books Albert had ordered from a catalog in Albuquerque. Clara's personalized with the particular chaos of a child who had strong opinions about how things should be arranged. Olive's things, her mother's watercolor and the Audubon book and the rag rug from the kitchen and the practical items of a woman's domestic life, moved into the ranch house and settled into it with a naturalness that surprised her. The property transition took the rest of the autumn to work out legally and practically. The homestead was not sold but incorporated into the larger operation, the orchard managed as a dedicated enterprise with 2 hands assigned specifically to it, the apple harvest that November being, despite 2 years of neglect, the best the trees had produced in 5 years. Olive managed the orchard with the focused expertise of someone who had grown up in one, and was glad to have the resource to do it properly. She also took over the household accounts for the ranch operation, because Albert's approach to bookkeeping was, she discovered with some exasperation, mathematically accurate but organizationally chaotic. "You have 4 different ledgers," she said, sitting at his desk in the first week of December with the book spread before her, for what should be one set of accounts. "They are organized by category," he said. "They are organized by whim," she said. "I am consolidating them." He looked over her shoulder at the books. "You do not have to, I am consolidating them," she said again, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he got her a fresh ledger from the supply shelf without being asked. "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome," he said, and there was something in his voice that was warm and slightly amused and deeply fond, and she kept her eyes on the ledger because she was going to get this accounting straight before she let herself be distracted. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly as he passed behind her, warm and certain, and she leaned slightly into it for just a moment before she straightened up and kept writing. December brought the first anniversary of the bank note, which they noted together and did not dwell on, and Christmas, which was the best Christmas Olive had experienced in several years, and which involved a wooden horse that Albert had carved for Clara over several weeks in the barn when he thought no one was watching, which Eli had ratted him out about in early November, and which Olive had kept secret with considerable effort. Clara received the horse and stared at it and looked up at Albert with an expression that went directly through every careful, practical defense Olive owned and lodged somewhere essential. "You made this," Clara said. "Your mother helped me paint it," Albert said, which was true and which had been one of the better evenings of her recent life, the two of them at the workbench in the barn with lamp oil and paint, and a level of conversation that ranged from the serious to the completely absurd. "It looks like the real horse," Clara said, meaning the gray mare in the south pasture that she had claimed an informal ownership stake in. "That was the intention," Albert said. Clara stood up and walked over to him with great purpose and hugged him around the knees, which was as high as she could reach, and Albert looked down at her with an expression that was, for a moment, completely unguarded, open and moved and certain all at once. He put his hand on top of her head very gently. Eli, from across the room, was watching this with an expression he was trying very hard to keep contained, which told Olive everything she needed to know about how her son felt about the way things had turned out. In the spring of 1884, the orchard came into full production for the first time under Olive's management. The apple harvest that October was 4 times what it had been when she arrived, and she arranged a contract with the Dusthaven Mercantile and with a general store in the next town over to take regular deliveries, which produced a revenue stream that was modest but consistent, and which was entirely hers to manage, a thing she had insisted on when they had discussed the business arrangement of the marriage, and which Albert had agreed to without any hesitation because, as he said, it was her orchard and her expertise and her income. He said this with a matter-of-fact straightforwardness that she knew, from the conversations she had with other women in Dusthaven, was not universal among men of his station, and she was grateful for it every time she thought about it, which was fairly often. In February of 1885, she told him she was expecting. She told him at breakfast, which was perhaps not the most dramatic setting, but she was not a dramatic woman and she had been holding it 3 days already, which was about as long as she could hold anything. He looked at her across the table. She watched him process it, first the understanding of what she had said, and then something that moved through his face in waves, like weather, like the slow smile but larger, something she had never quite seen before. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and went down on one knee beside her chair, which was completely unnecessary because she was right there and could see him fine from across the table, but he did it anyway, and he took both her hands in his. "Are you well?" he said. "I am well," she said. "I am very well." He pressed her hands against his face for a moment, his forehead bowed over them, and she felt rather than heard the long, steady breath he took. "Albert," she said gently. He looked up. His eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. "I did not think," he said, "that I would have this." She freed one hand and put it against his face, and he leaned into it like she had seen horses lean into a gentle touch, that simple animal trust. "You have it," she said. He stood up and pulled her up with him and held her, standing in the breakfast kitchen in the February morning light, and she put her arms around him and held on in return, and it was the kind of embrace that does not need to be anything other than what it is. The news went through Dusthaven at the speed these things always travel, which is to say Eli told his 2 best friends at school that same afternoon, and by the following Sunday it was known throughout the congregation, several members of which offered Olive congratulations before she had officially told anyone, which she accepted with grace, and the private acknowledgement that living in a small town meant that very little belonged to you alone for very long. Miriam Calloway squeezed her hands after services and said, "I am so happy for you," and meant it completely, and Olive found that she was happier than she had believed she would be capable of being in this second chapter of her life that she had not planned and could not have predicted. The summer of 1885 was hot, and the ranch was busy, and Albert had taken on 3 new hands to manage an expansion to the cattle operation that had required considerable planning, and a trip to Albuquerque for a legal matter regarding a grazing lease. He came back from Albuquerque with a book on obsidian tool-making for Eli, a small painted music box for Clara, and a length of the finest blue silk she had ever seen for Olive, which was an extravagant and entirely impractical gift that she kept folded in the cedar chest at the top of her wardrobe and brought out sometimes just to look at it. She told him this, and he looked pleased in the quiet way he looked pleased about things, and then he said he had bought it because it was the color of her eyes when the light hit them a certain way, and he had seen it in the window of a shop in Albuquerque and been unable to walk past. She stood in the doorway of their bedroom with the silk in her hands and looked at him, and thought that she had been 31 years old and walking 2 miles in the cold to knock on a door she had every reason to believe would stay shut, and she had been so afraid, standing at the base of those porch steps, and the door had opened before she finished raising her hand, and she had not known then what that would mean. Had not been able to see it from that cold October morning in 1882 to this summer afternoon in 1885, her children loud and growing in the next room, this man looking at her with silk in her hands and storm-gray eyes. "Albert," she said. "Yes. I am going to say something that I do not say enough." "You say everything I need to hear," he said. "I know," she said, "but I want you to hear this specifically." She folded the silk carefully and set it on the chest and went to him. "I am grateful for you, not for what you did with the bank note or the barn or the cattle or Geary. I am grateful for you, for the fact of you. For the way you looked at me when I came up those steps and opened the door before I knocked, as though you had already decided I was worth something before you knew what I wanted." She put her hands against his chest. "I love you, Albert Morgan." He put his arms around her and she felt the solidity of him, the reliable and particular reality of this person who had been, against all expectation, exactly what she needed. "I love you, Olive Morgan," he said against the top of her head. She stood in the circle of his arms in the afternoon light and let that be exactly what it was. Their son was born in October of 1885, on a Thursday morning that was cool and clear, the kind of autumn day that the territory did beautifully, gold and bronze, and the smell of the mountains in the air. Olive had wanted it on a Tuesday for reasons she could not entirely articulate, and the baby arrived on a Thursday regardless, which was the first indication that he was going to have opinions. They named him Henry Thomas Morgan, Henry for Albert's grandfather and Thomas for Olive's first husband, because the living and the dead both deserved to be held, and because Olive believed that the best way to honor what you had loved was not to put it away, but to carry it forward. Albert held his son for the first time with the careful, total attention of a man who understood that he was holding something irreplaceable, and Henry regarded him with the unfocused solemn gaze of the newly arrived, and Eli came in to see his brother with the expression of someone who is not entirely sure what to feel, and has decided to feel proud because it seems safest, and Clara immediately claimed the role of primary instruction giver, which Henry would have to deal with for the rest of his childhood. Dusthaven, when it heard, was collectively delighted. Old Hector Vasquez, who had taken an interest in the proceedings, announced at the general store that it was a good sign for the valley. The Reverend Calloway prepared a christening with evident satisfaction. Ruiz and Dawes and the ranch hands, informed by a beaming Eli who had run to the bunkhouse with the news before Albert even thought to send someone, expressed their pleasure in the particular way of frontier men, which involved considerable noise and a good deal of hat-throwing. Albert, when Olive told him what Eli had done, said, "Good, he knew it was important." "He's 10, she said. 10-year-olds know what is important, Albert said, with the particular confidence of a man who had been a thoughtful 10-year-old and had opinions about the matter. Henry was christened on a Sunday in November, held by both parents before the congregation, in the church where the courtship had been tracked by the movement of 2 pews. Miriam Calloway was predictably moved to tears. Clara stood in the pew between Eli and Ruiz, who had been invited because he was, as Clara explained, practically family, and held Alois Morgan with great ceremony. That winter was the warmest in several years, which the old-timers said was not a sign of good things, but which felt, in the specific comfort of the ranch house with the fire going, and the children fed and Henry learning the particular art of existing in the world, like generosity. Albert read aloud in the evenings, a habit that had developed sometime in the fall, from whatever he was reading himself or from the children's books as the occasion demanded, and Olive sat with her mending or her account books and listened to his voice filling the room, and thought that this was a kind of contentment that she had not known she was missing until she had it. She had been so afraid, walking up those porch steps. She had been so certain the door would stay shut, so prepared for one more refusal in a long season of them. The door had opened. That was the thing she thought about when she thought about how she had arrived here, in this life, with this person. Not the $42 or the beaver dams or the winter blizzard or the spring courtship or the September wedding or Henry asleep in the next room. All of those things, yes, but underneath them all, the simple and enormous fact of the door opening. The door that every person in Dusthaven had told her was the hardest door in the territory, swinging wide before her knuckles could even reach the wood, and Albert Morgan standing in it with his hat in his hand and the October light behind him. She had asked him about it once, after they were married, after Henry was born, on a quiet winter evening when the children were asleep and they were sitting by the fire with coffee. "Why did you open the door?" she had said. "Before I knocked. You said you had 10 minutes to decide and you decided no, and then you changed your mind. What changed it?" He was quiet for a moment. "The way you walked," he said. "I watched you come up the road. And you walked the way people walk when they have been told no everywhere else, and they are going to try one more place anyway, not because they expect it to work, but because they cannot tolerate the alternative of not having tried. I have seen that walk before and I have never been able to resist it, because it is the walk of someone who has not given up," and he paused. "And because I had been sitting in that house alone for 10 years and I was very tired of it, and you were walking up my road in the October cold with your best dress on and everything about you was—" He stopped again. "Real," he said. "You were real, from the first moment." She set her coffee cup down and moved to sit beside him on the settee rather than across from it, which required him to make room for her, which he did immediately, and she settled into the space beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him and looked at the fire. "I am very glad I knocked," she said. "I am very glad you came to the right house," he said. She laughed, which was something she did more of now than she had in years, a full and unpracticed laugh that she had been reclaiming slowly all this time, and he made a low sound that was the sound he made when she laughed, a sound she had decided she would work to produce as regularly as possible for the rest of her life. The years settled around them like good soil around strong roots. The ranch grew, managed by 2 people who between them had sufficient stubbornness and competence to outlast most problems the territory could produce. The orchard became what Olive had always known it could be, a proper operation, supplying fruit and preserves across a wider area as more towns developed along the new railroad line. Eli grew into a young man of serious intelligence and her father's belief in education, and at 17 expressed his intention to study natural history at the university in Albuquerque, which Albert supported with the same matter-of-fact thoroughness with which he supported everything, Eli set his mind to. Clara grew into a young woman of strong opinions and her mother's fearlessness. And at 15, she was the best rider on the property, including Ruiz, who was gracious about acknowledging this. The gray mare, which was technically Albert's horse, had been informally Clara's since she was 7 and was known throughout the operation simply as Clara's horse, a matter that had been settled by universal consensus. Henry learned to walk in the spring of his first year and spent the following years attempting to go places he was not supposed to go and be involved in things that were happening without him, which was so much his mother's nature that Albert pointed it out once, carefully, and Olive said she had no idea what he was talking about. In the spring of 1888, Olive discovered she was expecting again, which was announced at breakfast again, which was their established custom for announcements of significance, and Albert again came around the table to her and went to one knee beside her chair, because some gestures, once established as the right ones, do not need to change. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. Their daughter, born the following November, was named Me. She arrived in the world with auburn hair exactly like her mother's and eyes that changed shade in different lights the way Albert's did. And from the first week of her life, Clara appointed herself Me's primary protector, and Eli had an expression around her that was the same expression he had worn the day Henry was christened. The expression of a young man who is discovering, repeatedly, that he is capable of more feeling than he had previously expected. Henry, at 3, was not initially sure what he thought about Me, and spent several weeks conducting an assessment before concluding, at some point in December, that he approved of her. He communicated this primarily by bringing her things: his favorite stick, a smooth river stone, a piece of dried apple from the kitchen, and laying them beside her with the gravity of someone making an offering. Albert watched this from the doorway one afternoon and said quietly to Olive, who was standing beside him, "He is going to be a good man." She leaned against his shoulder. "He has a good example." They stood in the doorway and watched their son conducting his small, serious diplomacy, and outside the November light was going gold over the mountains, and the ranch beyond the window was exactly what it was: their work and their life, and the particular, irreplaceable thing they had built together from a door opening in October, and two people who had been honest with each other from the very beginning. She thought sometimes about the version of herself who had stood at the base of those porch steps in the cold, convinced the door would stay shut. She thought about how small and surrounded she had felt, and how the only thing she had been able to find in herself was the refusal to stop trying. She had not been brave so much as she had been unable to afford the alternative to bravery, and the door had opened anyway, before she even finished raising her hand. In 1889, New Mexico Territory was still not yet a state, though the conversations about statehood were growing louder, and the land was still young and difficult and demanding, and the winters still came down hard from the mountains, and the work never stopped, and the grief for Thomas was still there, would always be there, carried alongside everything else the way grief is carried when you live it honestly. But there was this too. There was Albert at the breakfast table in the morning, turning his coffee cup in his hands and reading a passage aloud from whatever he was currently into, not because anyone had asked, but because he found it worth saying. There was Eli's letters from Albuquerque, full of enthusiastic description of what he was learning and who he was meeting, arriving every 2 weeks with the reliability of a person who understood that his family wanted to hear from him. There was Clara on the gray mare in the early morning, moving through the pasture with an ease that was half horsemanship and half pure joy. There was Henry at 7, showing me the arrowhead collection he had inherited from the shelf, and explaining each one with his mother's directness and his stepfather's precision. There was Me herself, 2 years old and emphatic about everything, with her mother's hair and her father's eyes and the particular laugh that she had apparently brought entirely from herself. There was the kitchen in the evening and the fire and the books and the sound of Albert's voice reading, and the way he reached for her hand sometimes without looking, just the easy, habitual certainty of a person who reaches for what is reliably there. There was all of it. One evening in the deep winter of 1889, when the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet under snow and the fire was the center of the world, Albert set his book down and looked at her. "Are you happy?" he said. She looked up from her own book. It was such a direct question, so entirely like him, dispensing with the social hedge that the question usually wore. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "More than I knew how to be," he said. "More than I thought was available to me." She set her book down. She looked at him across the firelight, this man she had walked 2 miles in the cold to reach, who had opened the door before she knocked, who had looked at her with storm-gray eyes and said, "Whatever it is, the answer is yes," before he even knew the question. "I walked up those steps terrified," she said. "I know. I didn't think it would turn into this." "Neither did I," he said. "I thought I was going to help a neighbor with a banknote and a structural problem in her barn. And instead," he looked at her with that expression, the one she had been given from the beginning, the one that was complete and unhurried and entirely certain. "And instead," he said, "I got everything." She crossed the room and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and outside the snow was coming down in the soft, particular silence of a New Mexico winter night, and the fire burned warm and steady, and the house was full of the sound of sleeping children, and the land stretched away in every direction under the snow, their land, their life, their irreplaceable and particular and carefully built thing. She had knocked on the hardest door in the territory. He had opened it before she finished, and everything that came after had been worth every step of the 2 miles that had brought her there.